Nobody expected a teenage girl to save 296 lives at 37,000 feet. Not the experienced pilots. Not the terrified passengers. Not even she herself. But when fuel began pouring from the wings over the Pacific Ocean, she was the only one who knew exactly what to do. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Sophie Hayes pressed her highlighter against the page, marking another critical fuel system specification in her aviation textbook. The yellow ink bled slightly into the margin where she'd scrawled additional notes in cramped handwriting. Around her, Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 714 hummed with the white noise of routine, passengers sleeping under thin blankets, flight attendants rolling beverage carts down the aisle, overhead screens flickering with Hollywood comedies nobody was really watching. She didn't notice any of it. Her world had contracted to the technical diagram spread across her tray table, her Pacific Coast Flight Academy jacket bunched around her shoulders, the smell of recycled air mixing with her vanilla lip balm. 17 years old, sitting in seat 22A, window side, economy class, flying from San Francisco to Tokyo with 295 other souls who had no idea she was there. The man beside her shifted, glancing at her textbook with the bemused tolerance adults reserve for teenage ambitions. Learning to fly, huh? His voice carried that particular kindness that barely conceals skepticism. That's nice. My daughter wanted to be a pilot too when she was your age. Wanted. Past tense. Sophie caught it but smiled anyway. I'm working toward my private license. 68 hours so far. Well, good for you. He settled back into his magazine, conversation concluded, another dreaming teenager filed away in his mental catalog of passing encounters. Sophie returned to her textbook, but his words lingered like turbulence. Everyone spoke to her that way. Her classmates at Lincoln High who rolled their eyes when she skipped parties to study weather patterns. Her uncle who asked every Thanksgiving when she'd get serious about college. The flight school receptionist who still sometimes confused her with the child aviation camp participants. Nobody took 17 seriously. Nobody believed that behind her careful eyeliner and geometry homework lived someone who consumed aviation with religious intensity. Her bedroom walls weren't decorated with movie posters. They were covered with laminated aircraft systems diagrams, fuel, hydraulics, electrical, pneumatic. Her bookshelf held NTSB accident reports she'd printed and bound herself. Her phone contained folders of cockpit emergency videos she watched the way other kids watched TikTok. Her notebook, the one she carried everywhere, was filled with emergency checklists she'd memorized for aircraft she'd never fly. Not because they'd be on her private pilot exam. Because she needed to know. Because knowing was breathing. Her instructor, Captain Morrison, a retired airline pilot with 30,000 hours and hands that had flown through hurricanes, had told her parents, "Sophie's the most prepared student I've ever taught. Sometimes I think she knows more than I do about theory. She doesn't just memorize procedures, she understands why they exist. That's rare. That's what makes real pilots." Her father had beamed. Her mother had worried. Sophie had just absorbed the words like fuel, burning them for propulsion towards something she couldn't articulate but felt in her chest every time an aircraft climbed past her window. Now, 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, she traced her finger along a fuel system schematic, whispering component names like prayer. Transfer pump. Crossfeed valve. Surge tank. Override switch. The Boeing 787 beneath her carried roughly 220,000 pounds of jet fuel in its wing tanks. She knew the exact capacity. She knew the consumption rate. She knew that with headwinds, this flight would burn approximately 19,000 pounds per hour across 11 hours. She knew because she'd calculated it before boarding, the way other passengers calculated how many movies they could watch. Outside her window, the Pacific stretched endlessly. Blue water meeting blue sky, the horizon a mathematical line dividing nothing from nothing. No ships. No islands. No emergency landing options for thousands of miles in any direction. Just water and distance and the faith that metal wings would carry them across. Sophie loved it. Loved the impossible trust of flight. Loved that 296 people sat here reading and sleeping and texting, completely unbothered by the fact they were hurtling through thin air at 500 miles per hour, held aloft by physics they didn't understand. She understood it. She understood the lift coefficient, the angle of attack, the precise balance of thrust and drag and gravity that made this casual miracle possible. She flipped to the emergency procedures section, not because she was worried, the opposite. Because studying emergency procedures felt like practicing confidence. If you knew what to do when everything failed, nothing could surprise you. Engine fire. Rapid decompression. Electrical failure. Hydraulic loss. She'd memorized the memory items for all of them. She'd studied accidents where pilots forgot one critical step and accidents where they remembered and everyone survived. She studied to survive scenarios she prayed she'd never face. The Boeing 787 climbed slightly, adjusting altitude. Sophie felt it in her stomach, that gentle pressure change. She glanced at her watch. 3 hours into an 11-hour flight. 8 hours remaining. She highlighted another paragraph about fuel pump redundancy and settled deeper into her seat. She had no idea that in 4 minutes, everything would change. She had no idea that the maintenance error made during routine service in San Francisco, a fuel line seal improperly torqued, signed off by a mechanic too rushed to double-check, was about to fail completely. She had no idea that the seal in the port wing fuel tank, stressed by pressurization cycles and temperature extremes, was developing microscopic cracks. She had no idea that she was sitting in seat 22A because it was cheap, because student pilots count every dollar, because the universe was positioning her exactly where she needed to be. 4 minutes. Sophie turned the page, highlighter poised, completely absorbed. Then the seal failed. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Torres, age 56, 28 years with Trans-Pacific Airlines, 15,000 hours, was discussing his daughter's college acceptance with First Officer David Park. Normal conversation. Routine flight. The kind of peaceful crossing where the hardest decision is whether to have the chicken or pasta. Then the fuel quantity gauge for the port main tank flickered. Torres glanced at it. Frowned. Watched the digital readout drop by 200 pounds. Then 400. Then 600. His stomach tightened. Dave. Port fuel. Look. Park leaned over. The number was falling like water down a drain. 9,000 pounds gone in less than a minute. That's not consumption. That's leak. Torres's voice went flat, professional, the tone pilots use when their bodies are screaming but their training takes control. His hands moved across the fuel management panel, checking cross-feed valves, trying to isolate the problem. We're losing fuel. Port main tank. Fast. Park's fingers flew across the ECAM display, pulling up diagnostics. Running full system check. Maybe it's a sensor malfunction. It's not. Torres pointed at the physical fuel flow indicators. Look at the consumption delta. We're burning 3,000 pounds per hour total. The port tank is showing loss of over 2,000 pounds per minute. That's real. That's a catastrophic leak. The word hung in the cockpit. Catastrophic. Park's face drained of color. He pulled up the fuel management page, watching the digital counter spin downward with sickening speed. Trying to close port tank isolation, it's not responding. The leak's downstream of the shutoff valve. We can't stop it. Torres was already calculating. His mind, trained by 10,000 hours of routine and 500 hours of emergency simulation, processed the mathematics of survival. Current position, 800 nautical miles from Alaska, 1,200 from Tokyo. At this leak rate. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Park finished for him, voice hollow, we won't make landfall. Either direction. The cockpit went silent except for the whisper of ventilation and the soft beeping of systems monitoring their own mortality. Torres keyed the radio, voice controlled, every word measured. San Francisco Center, Trans-Pacific 714, we have a fuel emergency. Catastrophic leak from port tank, unable to isolate. Request immediate diversion to nearest suitable airport and priority handling. The controller's response came crisp and fast. Trans-Pacific 714, Roger. Nearest suitable is Anchorage, Alaska. 820 nautical miles your 10 o'clock. Cleared direct Anchorage, descend and maintain flight level 350. Emergency equipment will be standing by. 820 miles. Torres looked at the fuel gauges. Looked at Park. They both knew. They wouldn't make it. Park pulled up the fuel range calculator, inputting current consumption, leak rate, distance remaining. The computer was merciless, projected fuel exhaustion, 400 nautical miles prior to Anchorage. 400 miles short. Over the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Where water temperature was 48 degrees and survival time was measured in minutes. Torres made the announcement because procedure demanded it, but his voice couldn't hide the reality. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Torres. We've developed a fuel leak and are diverting to Anchorage, Alaska. This is a serious situation. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for possible emergency procedures. In seat 22A, Sophie heard every word he didn't say. The cabin erupted. Passengers sitting upright, conversation stopping, the immediate electric tension of people who suddenly understand they might die. A woman 3 rose up began crying. A man shouted something about turning around. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with forced calm, their training barely containing their own fear. Sophie's textbook was still open to the fuel systems page. Her highlighter was still in her hand. But her mind had already left the theoretical world and entered the practical. Fuel leak. Diverting. Serious situation. She knew what that meant. She knew the euphemisms pilots used. Serious situation meant life-threatening. Diverting meant they couldn't make their destination. Fuel leak meant they were bleeding their ability to fly. She looked out her window. Saw it immediately. A thin trail of vapor streaming from the wing, just aft of the engine. Barely visible, but unmistakable, fuel vaporizing in the cold air at altitude, a white tail betraying their catastrophe. Her stomach clenched. She'd studied this. She knew exactly what that vapor trail represented. She began calculating automatically, unable to stop herself. 787 fuel capacity, roughly 220,000 pounds. 3 hours into flight means approximately 60,000 consumed. Remaining fuel approximately 160,000 pounds. Visible vapor trail suggests major leak, possibly 2,000 to 3,000 pounds per minute. Distance to Alaska, 800 plus miles. Consumption rate to cover that distance, approximately 16,000 pounds per hour. Flight time needed, roughly 90 minutes. But with leak rate at 2,500 pounds per minute average, that's 150,000 pounds per hour leak rate. We're losing fuel faster than we can fly. The numbers didn't work. They were going to run out of fuel over the ocean. Sophie's hand started shaking. She gripped her textbook tighter, trying to ground herself in something solid. Around her, passengers were panicking. A child was screaming. Someone was praying loudly in Japanese. The man beside her had gone pale, staring at his phone like it could save him. Sophie stared at the vapor trail and tried to think. There had to be something. Some procedure. Some technique. She'd studied hundreds of emergency scenarios. There had to be an answer. Her mind raced through everything she knew. Fuel emergencies. Crossfeed procedures to balance fuel load. Altitude optimization for maximum range. Electrical load reduction to decrease fuel consumption. Engine out procedures to stretch glide distance. But those were all marginal improvements. They might save 10 miles. 20. They needed to save 400. The flight attendant call button chimed frantically as passengers demanded answers nobody had. Sophie closed her eyes, breathing carefully. Think. Think like a pilot. What would Captain Morrison ask? What does the situation require? 15 minutes passed. The vapor trail continued, visible proof of their dying aircraft. The cabin had descended into that particular quiet terror where people stop screaming and start calculating their final moments. Then the captain's voice returned on the public address system. But it wasn't the captain's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Park. His voice was tight, stressed, barely controlled. We have an additional situation. Captain Torres has collapsed. Medical emergency. I'm now the sole pilot, and I've never handled a fuel leak of this magnitude alone. I'm asking, his voice cracked, professionalism fracturing. Does anyone aboard have aviation experience? Any pilots? Any flight training? We need assistance in the cockpit immediately. The cabin froze. 296 people staring at each other with the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would stand up and save them. Nobody moved. Park's voice returned, now openly pleading, please. Anyone with any flight training at all. Student pilots. Military aviation. Anything. We're over the middle of the Pacific Ocean and we're running out of fuel. I need help. Sophie's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were sweating. Her textbook felt suddenly heavy in her lap. 68 hours. She had 68 hours of flight time. All in single-engine Cessnas that weighed less than one wing of this 787. She'd never flown anything with more than 4 seats. She'd never faced a real emergency. She'd never even finished her private pilot license. She was 17. She was a student. She was nobody. But she looked at the vapor trail still streaming from the wing. Looked at the passengers around her, families, children, people with lives and futures evaporating at 2,500 pounds per minute. Looked at her textbook, open to the exact page that explained fuel system failures. She thought of every emergency procedure she'd memorized. Every accident report she'd analyzed. Every what-if scenario she'd practiced in her mind while lying awake at night. She'd studied for this. Not this exact situation, but she'd studied the principles, the systems, the solutions. The co-pilot said he needed help. Any help. Any training. She had training. Maybe not enough. Maybe not the right kind. But she had knowledge. She had 68 hours of practice and 1,000 hours of study. And she was the only person on this aircraft who was standing up. Sophie stood. Small teenager in a Pacific Coast Flight Academy jacket, textbook clutched in her hands, legs shaking. The flight attendant rushed over immediately. Honey, please sit down. I'm a student pilot. Sophie's voice came out steadier than she felt. 68 hours. I know fuel systems. I know emergency procedures. I can help. The attendant blinked, looked at her like she was hallucinating. You're just a student. You're a child. The first officer asked for any pilot. Anyone with any training. Sophie's voice carried something that made people turn. Not arrogance. Not confidence. Just absolute certainty. I'm the only person who stood up. Let me help. An older man 3 rows back stood suddenly. Military bearing, gray hair, steady eyes. I'm retired Air Force. Colonel James Webb. Not a pilot, but I've been around aviation my entire career. He looked at Sophie, really looked, at her textbook, at her jacket, at the complete absence of doubt in her young eyes. I've seen enough pilots to recognize one. Let her try. The flight attendant looked between them, looked at the cockpit door, looked at the vapor trail still visible through the windows. Made the desperate calculation that doing something impossible was better than doing nothing. Come with me. Sophie's legs felt disconnected from her body as she walked forward. Passengers watched her pass, some confused, some horrified, some with desperate hope. A child whispered, "Is that girl going to fly the plane?" The cockpit door opened. Sophie stepped into a space she'd only imagined. The flight deck of a Boeing 787, screens glowing, switches everywhere, the curved windows showing endless Pacific horizon. And slumped in the left seat, unconscious, Captain Torres. And in the right seat, hands gripping the controls with white-knuckle intensity, First Officer David Park. He turned, saw a teenager, and his face collapsed. "You're a kid. You're just a kid. I'm a pilot." Sophie's voice cut through his despair. She moved to stand between the seats, textbook still in her hands, eyes scanning the instrument panel with recognition. "Student pilot, 68 hours, but I've studied fuel emergencies extensively. I know systems. I know procedures." She met his eyes. "Talk to me like I'm your crew. What's our situation?" Something in her tone, professional, direct, unafraid, made Park treat her seriously. His training kicked in, assess resources, use what you have. Port main tank catastrophic leak. Lost 40% of our total fuel. Leak rate approximately 2,500 pounds per minute. Unable to isolate. Captain suffered heart attack, non-responsive. I'm flying manually, trying to optimize for maximum range, but we're not going to make Alaska. Sophie's mind processed the information with the speed of pure training. Fuel cross-feed. Have you balanced the load? Port tank is leaking, are you cross-feeding from starboard tanks to port to maintain symmetric weight distribution? Park stared at her. I haven't. I've been focused on navigation and keeping us stable. Do it now. Sophie's textbook knowledge, theories she'd studied on Saturday afternoons while other kids went to movies, became suddenly critical. Asymmetric fuel load increases drag coefficient. The aircraft is flying wings level but with unbalanced weight, you're creating induced drag that's costing fuel efficiency. Every mile matters. Transfer fuel to balance. Park's hands moved across the fuel management panel. The transfer pumps engaged. After 30 seconds, the aircraft's handling improved subtly, reduction in the slight yaw compensation he'd been unconsciously maintaining. He looked at Sophie with something between shock and hope. How did you know? I study. Sophie slid into the captain's seat, too small for it, her feet barely reaching the rudder pedals, but her hands moved to the instrument panel instinctively. What else haven't you tried? Park exhaled shakily. Everything I know. Optimal altitude for range. Reduced electrical load. Direct routing. But the leak rate is too high. We're still going to flame out approximately 400 miles from Anchorage. Sophie scanned the fuel quantity indicators. Port tank nearly empty. Starboard tanks draining to compensate. The mathematics were brutal. She pulled her notebook from her jacket pocket, the one filled with calculations and checklists, and began writing numbers. Current fuel remaining, she asked. Approximately 42,000 pounds and falling. Distance to Anchorage. 680 nautical miles at current position. Sophie calculated rapidly, her pencil scratching. Fuel consumption rate at optimal altitude and configuration, approximately 16,000 pounds per hour. Flight time needed, roughly 75 minutes. Fuel required, roughly 20,000 pounds plus reserves. But leak rate at 2,500 per minute means we're losing an additional 187,500 pounds per hour. She looked up. We have about 12 minutes of fuel before total exhaustion at this rate. Park's voice broke. Then we're done. We ditch in the ocean. Everyone dies. No. Sophie's mind was racing through every procedure, every technique, every unconventional solution she'd ever studied. There had to be something. She thought of accident reports where pilots saved impossible situations. Thought of the Gimli glider, the aircraft that ran out of fuel at altitude and glided 70 miles. Thought of engine out procedure. She said it quietly, then louder, engine out single-engine flight. Park looked at her like she was insane. You want to shut down an engine? Deliberately? On a fuel emergency? We're not in a fuel emergency. We're in a fuel exhaustion emergency. The difference matters. Sophie's voice carried authority that shouldn't exist in someone 17. We're going to run out of fuel before we reach land. That's guaranteed. But if we shut down one engine now, intentionally, we reduce fuel consumption dramatically. We fly on single engine and stretch our range. That's not in any manual for, Park started. It's not in commercial manuals because it's risky and unconventional. But we're already dying. Sophie opened her textbook to a page she'd marked months ago, a study on single-engine ferry flights. 787 can maintain altitude on single engine at reduced weight. We're light on fuel now. We shut down the starboard engine, reduce our drag, cut our consumption nearly in half. We won't make anchorage, but we'll extend our range enough to. Enough to what? We still run out of fuel over water. Sophie looked at him. We extend range enough to get into military tanker aircraft operational radius. Alaska has Air Force bases. They have KC-135 tankers that can refuel us in flight. But we need to get close enough for them to reach us. Park stared. Aerial refueling? Of a commercial airliner? That's technically possible. It's been done in emergencies. The 787 has a refueling port, it's designed for military cargo variants. Sophie pointed to a panel diagram in her textbook. I've read about this. I know where the receptacle is. I know the procedure. You've read about it? You've never actually. Have you? Sophie met his eyes. Nobody on this aircraft has done this. But I've studied it. I know the theory. And theory is all we have. Park was silent, weighing impossible against certain death. Sophie pressed, we have 12 minutes of fuel at current consumption. If we shut down one engine, we buy maybe 30 minutes. That's 30 minutes for Air Force tankers to reach us. Calculated risk versus guaranteed failure. Park made the decision. Okay. Okay, we're trying it. Tell me what to do. Sophie talked him through the procedure, pulling information from memory and textbook, shut down starboard engine. Reduce electrical load to minimum, APU off, unnecessary systems off. Fly at optimum single-engine altitude, should be around 28,000 feet given our current weight. Minimize drag, landing gear verified up, flaps clean, speed brakes retracted. Park executed each step, his hands steadier now that he had a plan, any plan. The starboard engine wound down, the familiar twin-engine hum becoming singular. The aircraft shuddered slightly, handling characteristics changing, but Park compensated smoothly. Sophie was already on the radio, her voice young but professional. Anchorage Center, Trans-Pacific 714, we've initiated single-engine flight to extend range. We need immediate military tanker support for in-flight refueling. We're approximately 650 nautical miles southwest of your position. Can you coordinate KC-135 intercept? The controller's voice came back shocked, Trans-Pacific 714, say again. You're requesting aerial refueling? Of a commercial aircraft? Affirmative. We have estimated 20 minutes of fuel remaining. Without tanker support, we will flame out over the Pacific. This is our only option. There was a pause. Then, Trans-Pacific 714, stand by. Sophie turned back to the instruments, monitoring fuel quantity. She pulled up the flight management system, calculating optimal routing for tanker intercept. Her fingers moved across screens she'd never touched before, but the logic was familiar. Navigation was navigation, whether in a Cessna or a 787. Park watched her with something like awe. "Who are you?" "Really?" "Sophie Hayes. Senior at Lincoln High. I work at a coffee shop on weekends to pay for flight lessons." She didn't look up from the calculations. "I just really love aviation." "You're 17 and you're saving 296 people. We haven't saved anyone yet." Sophie's voice was tight. "We're still 12 minutes short." The radio crackled, Trans-Pacific 714, Anchorage Center. "We have 2 KC-135 tankers launching immediately from Elmendorf Air Force Base. Call sign Argo Flight. They'll be at your position in approximately 45 minutes. Can you maintain flight that long?" Sophie looked at the fuel gauges. Looked at Park. Did the math in her head one more time. "If everything goes perfectly, maybe." Park keyed the microphone, Anchorage Center, Trans-Pacific 714. "We'll do our best. We're flying optimal single-engine profile. Please advise tankers we are a Boeing 787 with non-standard refueling configuration. We'll need boom operator patience." "Roger, 714. Argo Flight is advised. They're bringing extra fuel and will have emergency flotation equipment standing by." The words nobody wanted to hear, flotation equipment. In case they didn't make it. Sophie settled into the captain's seat, textbook open across her lap, notebook beside her, and began the longest countdown of her life. She monitored every gauge, every indicator, every system. She called out fuel remaining every 2 minutes. She calculated wind correction factors to optimize their track. She managed electrical loads, shutting down even the in-flight entertainment system to save every possible watt of generator load that translated to fuel burn. Park flew, his hands steady on the controls, trusting this teenage student pilot who knew procedures he'd never learned. 20 minutes passed. Fuel gauges dropping. The port tank completely empty now, the starboard tanks draining steadily. Numbers falling like sand through fingers. 25 minutes. Sophie recalculated range, "We're going to be close. Really close." 30 minutes. The fuel low-level warning illuminated. Amber lights glowing across the fuel panel. They were running on fumes. 35 minutes. Park's voice was steady but Sophie could hear the strain, any sign of the tankers. Sophie scanned the sky ahead, straining to see. Nothing but blue and clouds and the curve of the earth. Not yet. They should be. Trans-Pacific 714, Argo Flight Lead. We have you on radar. 25 miles ahead. We're coming to you. Sophie's breath caught. She grabbed binoculars from the cockpit emergency kit, pressing them to her eyes. Scanned the horizon. And there, tiny dots growing larger. 2 KC-135 tankers, military gray, boom refueling equipment visible. Visual contact, she called out. 2 tankers, 12 o'clock, approximately 20 miles. Park allowed himself the smallest smile. Tell them we're ready. Sophie keyed the radio, Argo lead, Trans-Pacific 714. We are ready for emergency refueling. First time for this crew. We'll need guidance. The tanker pilot's voice came back calm and professional, Trans-Pacific 714, Argo lead. No worries. We'll talk you through. Move into position 50 feet behind our boom. Hold steady. Our boom operator will do the rest. How much fuel do you have remaining? Sophie checked the gauge. Her stomach dropped. Argo lead, we're showing 1,800 pounds remaining. Maybe 5 minutes. Copy that. Let's not waste time. Closing to refueling position now. The lead tanker slowed, descended slightly. Park maneuvered the 787 behind it, delicate flying, the kind of precision that normally took years to develop. But Sophie coached him through it, reading closure rates and positions from her textbook's descriptions of formation flying. Little left. You're drifting right. Up slightly. Hold it. Hold it. Perfect. The refueling boom extended from the tanker, a long metal probe reaching back toward them. The boom operator, skilled Air Force crew member who'd refueled fighters and bombers but never a commercial airliner, guided it carefully toward the 787's refueling receptacle, just behind the cockpit. Sophie watched through the forward windows, her hands gripping her notebook until her knuckles went white. The boom moved closer. Closer. Made contact. Contact, the boom operator called. Transferring fuel. Flow rate 3,000 pounds per minute. Hang steady. Park held the aircraft stable, sweat running down his face despite the cool cockpit temperature. Sophie watched the fuel gauge. Watched it continue falling, 1,500 pounds, 1,200 pounds, still burning fuel as the tanker began pumping. 900 pounds. Come on, she whispered. Come on. 600 pounds. The fuel gauge hesitated. Steadied. Then began climbing. 800 pounds. 1,200, 2,000. 5,000. Sophie started crying. Couldn't help it. Tears running down her face as the gauge climbed higher and higher, life flowing back into their dying aircraft. Park's voice was shaky. Argo lead, Transpacific 714. We are receiving fuel. You are saving 296 lives. Thank you. Transpacific 714, Argo lead. That's what we do. Taking you up to 40,000 pounds. That'll get you to Anchorage with plenty of reserve. 20 minutes later, the refueling complete, the boom disconnected. The 787 pulled away from the tanker, fuel tanks replenished, engines fed, death averted. The tanker pilot's voice came one last time, Transpacific 714, Argo lead. Hell of a flying. Safe landing. Argo flight returning to base. Sophie and Park watched the tankers bank away, disappearing into the distance. Then they looked at each other. Park's hands were shaking now that the crisis was past. We just, how did you? Sophie wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. I studied engine-out procedures. I knew single-engine flight was possible. I knew aerial refueling existed. I put it together. You did what pilots with 10,000 hours wouldn't think of. You're 17. How is that possible? Because I'm not experienced, Sophie said through her tears. I don't know what's impossible yet. I just know what the textbooks say works. And I believe them. Park started laughing, relief and shock and disbelief mixing together. You believed a textbook more than I believed my training. And you were right. Sophie restarted the starboard engine. The aircraft returned to normal twin-engine flight. She helped Park configure the systems for approach to Anchorage. She monitored Captain Torres, who was breathing steadily, unconscious but stable. 90 minutes later, Transpacific Airlines Flight 714 touched down on runway 7L in Anchorage, Alaska. Emergency vehicles lined the runway. Ambulances waited for the captain. News helicopters circled overhead, already broadcasting the impossible survival. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, the cabin erupted in applause and sobbing and prayers of thanks. Passengers hugged strangers. Children cried for their parents who cried back. Sophie sat in the captain's seat, textbook closed now, hands finally stopping their shaking. Park reached over and squeezed her shoulder. You saved us, he said simply. All of us. Sophie looked at him, this professional pilot who trusted a teenage student to help him fly, and said the only thing that felt true, we saved each other. You flew. I just helped. You did more than help. You knew things I didn't know. You thought of solutions I never would have found. Park's voice was filled with emotion. Sophie Hayes, you're 17 years old with 68 hours, but you think like a pilot with 20,000 hours. Do you understand what that means? Sophie didn't answer. Didn't know how to answer. She just sat there as emergency crews opened the cabin door and paramedics rushed in for the captain and flight attendants began helping passengers evacuate, and her entire body finally understood they were alive, they were safe, they'd survived. The media found her within hours. By the time Sophie's parents arrived from San Francisco, panicked, terrified, incredulous, she was already on every news channel. 17-year-old student pilot saves Pacific flight. Teen with 68 hours of experience lands 787 after mid-ocean fuel crisis. High school seniors' aviation knowledge saves 296 lives. The press conference was chaos. Sophie sat at a table with First Officer Park, both of them looking exhausted and overwhelmed. Her Pacific Coast Flight Academy jacket had become an inadvertent uniform, the logo visible in every photograph. A reporter shouted, "Sophie, how did you know what to do? You're still a student." Sophie leaned toward the microphone, voice quiet, "I didn't really know. I study a lot. I read textbooks and accident reports and emergency procedures. I practice scenarios in my head. When the real emergency happened, it was like all that studying became real. I just did what I'd already thought about 100 times." Another reporter, First Officer Park, what was it like having a teenager help fly a commercial airliner? Park looked at Sophie before answering. Terrifying at first. Then humbling. Sophie knew procedures I'd never heard of. She calculated solutions I couldn't see. She knew about single-engine ferry operations, aerial refueling capabilities, optimal fuel management techniques that aren't in standard commercial training. She proved something I didn't know I needed to learn, that experience isn't just about hours in the cockpit. It's about dedication to knowledge. It's about studying beyond the minimum. It's about being prepared for situations you pray you'll never face. A third reporter, Sophie, what do you want people to know about what happened? Sophie thought carefully. I want people to know I didn't do anything special. Any student pilot who studies hard knows these procedures. I got lucky that my studying paid off. But mostly. She paused, choosing words. Mostly I want people to know that young people are capable of more than they're given credit for. Everyone told me I was just a kid, just a student, just someone dreaming. But when it mattered, what mattered wasn't my age. It was what I knew. It was being ready. Her voice got stronger, don't underestimate young people just because they're young. We can learn. We can prepare. We can step up when we need to. Age doesn't determine capability. Dedication does. The room erupted in applause. After the press conference, an FAA official approached Sophie and her parents. "Miss Hayes, I'm Director Margaret Chen from the FAA's Flight Standards Division. What you demonstrated up there, the fuel management protocols, the engine-out procedures, the aerial refueling coordination, where exactly did you learn all that?" Sophie looked uncertain, still processing that she was being questioned by federal aviation authorities. Books, mostly. Aviation textbooks. NTSB accident reports. I download cockpit emergency videos. I study accident investigations to understand what went wrong and what went right. I really love learning about aviation. Director Chen nodded slowly. Your flight instructor submitted a report about your training. Captain Morrison says you're the most naturally gifted student he's taught in 40 years. Your knowledge base extends far beyond private pilot requirements. She paused. The FAA would like to offer you something. An accelerated training program. Full sponsorship. We'd fast-track your certifications, private, instrument, commercial, multi-engine. With what you've demonstrated, we believe you could complete in 18 months what normally takes 3 to 4 years. Sophie's eyes went wide. You're serious? But I haven't even passed my private pilot check ride. You've passed something harder, Director Chen said. You've passed the ultimate test. You saved 296 lives with knowledge and clear thinking under pressure that many career pilots never develop. That's worth more than any check ride. Sophie's mother, still pale from the stress of nearly losing her daughter, squeezed her hand. Sophie, you don't have to decide now. Yes, Sophie interrupted. Yes, I want that. Please. Director Chen smiled. Then we'll make it happen. First Officer Park stood nearby, watching. He approached as Director Chen left. Sophie, I have something to ask you. Once you get your commercial license, once you're qualified, I'm recommending you for Trans-Pacific Airlines cadet program. I'm going to personally sponsor your application. I want to fly with you again. As equals next time. Sophie felt tears threatening again. You really mean that? I've never meant anything more. You saved my life. You saved 296 lives. But more than that, you showed me what a real pilot is. It's not about hours. It's not about experience. It's about knowledge, preparation, and courage. You have all three. Colonel Webb, the retired Air Force officer who'd vouched for her, approached next. Young lady, I've seen a lot of pilots in my time. Fighter jocks, transport crews, test pilots. You've got something special. Something that can't be taught, you've got the mind of an aviator. The rest is just practice. Sophie thanked him, overwhelmed by the attention, by the validation, by the sudden transformation of her life from anonymous student to recognized pilot. Captain Torres, recovered from his heart attack and released from the hospital 2 days later, requested to meet her. They sat in a quiet hospital conference room, him in a wheelchair, her still wearing that flight academy jacket. I heard everything that happened, Torres said. I heard you coached Park through procedures I didn't know existed. I heard you calculated single-engine flight profiles and coordinated military refueling. I heard you saved my aircraft and everyone on it. He extended his hand. Thank you. From one pilot to another. Sophie shook his hand, feeling the weight of those words. One pilot to another. Not student to captain. Not child to adult. Pilot to pilot. How are you feeling, sir? She asked. Lucky to be alive. Lucky you were on that flight. He smiled. The doctors say I'm done flying commercially. Heart condition. I'm being retired medically. But you know what? I'm okay with that. Because I know the next generation, your generation, is ready. More than ready. 6 months later, Sophie Hayes stood in the lobby of Pacific Coast Flight Academy, looking at the wall of achievement plaques. Her name was there now, larger than the others, Sophie Hayes, youngest pilot to assist in saving a commercial airliner, 296 lives saved, Pacific Flight 714. She wore her commercial pilot uniform now, crisp white shirt with epaulets showing her newly earned stripes, black slacks, polished shoes. At 18 years old, she'd completed her private license, instrument rating, commercial certificate, and multi-engine qualification in 6 months of intensive training. The FAA's accelerated program, combined with her already extensive theoretical knowledge, had compressed years of training into focused expertise. Captain Morrison approached, grinning. Ready for your first day, Captain Hayes? Not captain yet, Sophie corrected. First officer. Still need the hours. You'll get there. Faster than anyone expects. He handed her a folder. Your assignment. Trans-Pacific Airlines Cadet Program. You start next week. First Officer Park specifically requested you for his crew once you complete the type rating course. Sophie opened the folder. Boeing 787 type rating. The same aircraft she'd helped save. She smiled at the symmetry. How does it feel? Morrison asked. 6 months ago you were studying in my Cessna 172. Now you're about to fly wide-body international routes. Surreal, Sophie admitted. Sometimes I still can't believe it happened. That any of it was real. It was real. You made it real. You took theoretical knowledge and applied it when it mattered most. That's what separates good pilots from great ones, the ability to think under pressure, to use knowledge creatively, to never give up. Sophie looked at her reflection in the glass display case. Still young, still small, still the same person who'd sat in seat 22A studying her textbook. But different too. Changed by crisis, matured by responsibility, transformed by the understanding that she was capable of more than anyone had believed. Captain Morrison, she said quietly. Thank you. For believing in me when I was just another kid who said she wanted to fly. Sophie, you were never just another kid. From your first lesson, you were a pilot waiting to prove it. He squeezed her shoulder. Now go prove it again. Every single flight. Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 714's route, San Francisco to Tokyo, resumed operations 3 weeks after the incident with new aircraft and enhanced maintenance protocols. The investigation revealed the fuel seal failure had been caused by improper installation and insufficient quality control. New procedures were implemented across the fleet. Sophie's first flight as a newly minted Trans-Pacific first officer, 9 months after the emergency, was the same route. Flight 714. San Francisco to Tokyo. As she walked through the terminal in her uniform, passengers recognized her. Some took photos. Some thanked her. Some just stared in awe at the teenager who'd become a pilot through the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. She met First Officer Park at the gate. He was now Captain Park, promoted after the incident for his skilled handling of the emergency. He grinned when he saw her. First Officer Hayes, reporting for duty, sir, Sophie said formally. None of that, sir, stuff between us. We've been through too much. Park shook her hand. Ready to fly? Ready. They walked to the aircraft together. The same type of 787. The same route. But this time, Sophie was crew, not passenger. This time, she belonged in that cockpit. As they completed the pre-flight checks, Park asked, do you ever think about that day? The fuel leak? The emergency? Sophie looked at the fuel panel, remembering the gauges falling, the desperate calculations, the impossible choices. Every flight. Every single flight. It reminds me why I do this. Why all the studying and preparation matters. Does it scare you? Flying the same route? No. Sophie's voice was certain. It makes me confident. Because I know now, really know, that if something goes wrong, I can handle it. We can handle it. That's what training is for. That's what knowledge is for. They completed the checklist. Passengers boarded, new passengers who didn't know this was Sophie's first official flight on this route, who didn't know she'd once saved this exact flight number from catastrophe. A flight attendant stopped by the cockpit. Excuse me, Captain Park. There's a teenage girl in seat 22A who wanted me to give this to you. She handed Park an envelope. He opened it. Inside was a note, I'm a student pilot. Just starting lessons. I'm studying aviation textbooks during the flight, just like Sophie Hayes did. If there's ever an emergency, I want to be ready too. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Rachel Chen, age 16. Park handed the note to Sophie. She read it, felt her eyes getting wet. You inspired her, Park said softly. You inspired a whole generation. There are kids all over the world studying harder, preparing better, believing they can be pilots because you showed them that age doesn't matter. Knowledge matters. Dedication matters. Sophie folded the note carefully. I just did what I was trained to do. No. You did what you prepared yourself to do. There's a difference. Park started the engine sequence. You went beyond training. You studied accidents you'd never face. You memorized procedures you'd never need. You prepared for scenarios everyone said were impossible. And when the impossible happened, you were ready. The engine spooled up. Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 714 pushed back from the gate. As they taxied toward the runway, Sophie looked out at San Francisco Bay, the same view she'd had as a passenger 9 months ago, the same departure point where her life had changed forever. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Park advanced the throttles. The 787 accelerated down the runway, physics and engineering combining to lift 400,000 pounds of aircraft and people into the sky. Sophie monitored the instruments, calling out speeds, watching systems, being the pilot she'd studied to become and the pilot she'd proven she already was. At rotation speed, Park pulled back on the controls. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the California sky. Positive rate, Sophie called out. Gear up. They climbed through the clouds, breaking into brilliant sunshine, the Pacific Ocean spreading below them like an endless blue promise. Years later, Captain Sophie Hayes would command her own aircraft. She would fly thousands of hours without incident. She would train new pilots, teaching them the same obsessive preparation that had saved her life and the lives of 296 others. She would speak at aviation conferences, always telling the same story with the same message: experience isn't measured in years. It's measured in dedication. It's measured in the hours you spend studying when you don't have to. It's measured in the scenarios you practice in your mind when nothing's wrong. It's measured in the belief that knowledge matters, that preparation matters, that you can be ready for anything if you're willing to learn everything. Young pilots would ask her, "How did you stay calm? How did you know what to do?" And she would always answer the same way, "Because I'd already flown it 100 times in my head." When it became real, it was just another flight. Just another problem to solve. Just another reason to remember why I fell in love with aviation in the first place. She would never forget sitting in seat 22A with her textbook and highlighter, studying fuel systems while passengers slept, never imagining that those exact pages would soon save their lives. She would never forget the vapor trail streaming from the wing, visible proof of catastrophe. She would never forget standing up when no one else would, walking to that cockpit, being 17 and terrified and certain all at once. She would never forget First Officer Park's face when he saw her, desperation turning to hope, skepticism turning to trust. She would never forget the fuel gauge falling towards zero. She would never forget the moment the refueling boom connected and life flowed back into dying engines. She would never forget that heroes aren't defined by years of experience. They're defined by dedication to learning and courage to act when others won't. And she would never, ever forget the most important lesson aviation taught her. Prepare for everything. Because someday, everything might depend on whether you did. Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 714 flies daily now, San Francisco to Tokyo, carrying passengers who don't know its history, who don't remember the day it almost fell into the Pacific Ocean. But the aviation community remembers. The FAA now includes Sophie's emergency procedures and advanced training curricula, single-engine ferry operations for emergency range extension, unconventional fuel management, creative problem-solving under pressure. Aircraft maintenance protocols were strengthened worldwide because of the investigation into her flight's fuel leak. Hundreds of young pilots study harder, prepare better, believe more because Sophie Hayes proved that 17-year-olds can save 296 lives if they're dedicated enough to learn. And somewhere, right now, a teenage student pilot sits in seat 22A of an aircraft, textbook open, highlighter in hand, studying emergency procedures for scenarios they pray they'll never face. Studying because Sophie Hayes taught them that someday, what you study might save lives. Studying because knowledge is power, and preparation is survival, and age is just a number when you have the mind of a pilot. Studying because heroes are made in quiet moments of dedication, long before crisis calls their name. Experience isn't measured in hours logged. It's measured in lessons learned, knowledge absorbed, and courage discovered when everything depends on what you know. Sophie Hayes, 68 flight hours. 296 lives saved. Proof that determination and preparation can overcome any obstacle, any doubt, any limitation the world places on you. Fly prepared. Study hard. When your moment comes, be ready.